Right, seniors, this is Mr. Axum, and we're doing a little review here of our discussions today in class. So, talking about the steps in relationship, and this is where we're beginning in our textbook. And there are 5 steps in relationship, and we're beginning with this first one here on awareness and discovery. And this is where we're talking about being aware and discovering more of the differences between what it means to be male and female. So here's a kind of a funny artistic sketch of a person's ideas about the differences between the ways in which men and women think and process things. And so here's this huge part of the woman's brain and her psyche that is always thinking about love. That's processed very differently in the male brain when he's thinking, he's not thinking about love, he's thinking about sex. And again, there's lots of TV shows and comedies and funny sketches of how this works itself out, but it's very true that men and women process that particular aspect of marriage and being close to one another very differently. Here's another person's idea of how complicated and maybe how simple the ways in which men and women differ when it comes to just thinking, feeling, lots of diodes, lots of knobs, lots of things that I'm not really quite sure what all these knobs do. It's very sophisticated, it's very involved, very intricate, whereas a guy just seems very straightforward. Either he's with you, he's not with you. He's kind of thinking about you or he's not thinking about you. And then yesterday we spent a lot of time talking about psychological differences between men and women. So this is, when we say psychological, this is how a person feels, their emotions, and when they perceive or think about things, like how they respond to that emotionally, and the feeling component. So again, differences here for the woman. There's a high need to feel loved. And what does that look like? It's kind of like that previous picture of the woman when she's thinking about love in the brain. And so that means romance. That means time together. That means tender touching apart from sex as a married couple. That means the sending and giving of notes or cards or the big or small actions, but a lot of times just the small actions that say, hey, I'm thinking about you. You're important to me. A woman is much more emotional and in touch with her emotions than a man is. There's all kinds of thoughts that she's having, all kinds of events, and they all interconnect with each other because there's feelings with all of those events. And she's able to actually juggle a lot of different thoughts and feelings at once. And finally, we talked about the need to listen and not to fix. When it comes to men, again, psychological differences, there's this high need to provide. This is a big part of who a man is, that he finds a lot of self-esteem in his work. And he puts a lot of himself into his work. That there is the big difference between how men process this whole idea of what it means to love or to be romantic. Man typically thinks of, well, that means sex, and I have a high sex drive. And then finally, the need for respect is big, and some of that ties to finding worth in the work that they do, whether that's the work that they're doing as an occupation and or that's work that they're doing around the house. Finally, men are a lot more visual than women, and so thus sexually stimulated through the eyes, and their emotions are much more in check. They're not as emotional as women. And then we talked about in the book For Men Only that the men were learning from the woman's perspective that a big need is for the woman to continue to know that you love her, and that is demonstrated by your pursuit of her. And so again, think back to what we just talked about in terms of how a woman thinks about romance and what is romantic to a woman and what is attractive to a woman. It has a lot to do with her husband pursuing her with notes and cards and actions that prove and show and demonstrate, yes, honey, I still love you. And for for the women, a book that talks about just these three great needs in a man's life and three great ways in which he processes things. And sex is a huge part of how the male thinks. And then his need for respect and his need to be affirmed. And so for a wife to understand the emotional needs of her husband, this is a huge part. And we took some time to ask some questions about differences. Like when we think about these kinds of differences, just on the psychological level, does that mean that because women are more emotional, then that means they're more fragile of a person and that that's not a good thing? Or that men place too much of their worth in their work and that's a bad thing? Um, and so, do these differences lead us to believe that one sex is greater or better or more superior than another? And what we began to think about are, well, we know that there are distinctions and differences within the Trinity. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit is not the Father. They each have different roles that they play. But in their person, there's equality. Each of them is God. But there are three persons. There's a distinction, and those persons have roles they play. They each are known for different aspects. And so the same is true, man and woman, male and female, have been made to reflect the glory of God. Men and women have been made in the image and likeness of God, and therefore God has chosen to reveal himself and in the world through male and through female, both in terms of our different, especially in our differences, in the ways in which we act and behave differently. The world obviously would want to minimize those differences because um, where the Bible wants to make things distinct, the world often wants to minimize those distinctions and say it doesn't matter, they're interchangeable. But we're not interchangeable. That's the truth, that we're hardwired as male and female to think and act and behave in certain ways, certainly under the influence of the Holy Spirit. And in our marriages, we need to come to appreciate those differences. So again, differences don't mean less importance or less value, and it certainly doesn't mean that we see each other as less in God's eyes, but they reflect the reality that God has chosen in his wisdom to reveal his glory and his likeness through mankind and the differences that we find there. And so we must begin to treasure and value and embrace and learn from one another as we discover these differences. We talked today a little bit about Valentine's Day, and the gentlemen were putting together a top 10 list of what do you think women want to receive, and ladies, what do you think men give? And what we found is that they think very differently about what's important and what's valuable. And we have to learn to appreciate those differences, not scold one another that one is right and what is wrong. But particularly on this day, like what is valuable? Husbands, future husbands of the world, what is valuable to your wife? Well, it's not the same things necessarily that you immediately value. And wives, what is valuable to your husbands on Valentine's Day? And learning to appreciate and meet each other's needs through that. There was a survey that's talked about in the book. This is kind of interesting. And again, showing differences psychologically, feeling. 100,000 women asked the question, how important is sex versus romance? And almost 3/4 of the women in the survey answered they would prefer to be held rather than having intercourse. Obviously, that's much different from the male, and much more preferring to have intercourse versus, lying around or sitting around holding one another. And again, these differences are not right or wrong; they're simply different, and we need to come to appreciate one another. So, conclusions. For the woman, the touch, the hold, the loving words, the small gifts, those are the lifeblood for a woman in dating and marriage. For men, those same things, but not so much. They have other things that they appreciate, being honored, being esteemed, maybe being surprised. Um, and so, thus, we're having to learn to love and appreciate differences. So tomorrow we're going to spend some time thinking about the physiological differences between men and women. You've looked a little bit of that in your book, and we're going to explore that even more.